Greetings, my name is Joel Kmeyer, and this is a pre-recorded narrative of the business meeting that we will be conducting on May 21 for the Infectious Diseases Society of Ohio Annual Meeting. I'll speak today on behalf of Konstantin Sigrelis, the current IDSO President, as well as Michael Parrott, the current IDSO Secretary Treasurer. Our agenda for the business meeting will include the 2021-2022 annual report. We'll present a vision for 2022-2023. And for the business meeting, we'll also include comments about financial statements, bylaw amendments, and officer elections, as we do at every business meeting. We'll begin by discussing our 2021-2022 annual report. This past year, like all busy ID clinicians, we were primarily occupied by the COVID-19 pandemic. Our activities this year included preparations for the IDSO Annual Meeting. We worked to develop and distribute a Qualtrics survey, and I will integrate that in my comments today. We did identify representative counselors throughout the state of Ohio. We performed upgrades on idohio.org, including the development of a credit card membership option. We worked to develop a list of physicians in the state of Ohio. ID Ohio was signatory to an ID biopreparedness workforce sign-on letter. Tom File and I guest authored an article titled "Court Ruling Dismisses Science, Jeopardizes Ohioans' Health" in the Ohio Capital Journal. We acquired a permanent mailing address for IDSO, and we worked to perform a reevaluation of the appropriateness of IDSO committees, and I'll discuss some of this in more detail now. Our annual meeting was canceled in 2020, and we had a virtual meeting in 2021 due to COVID-19. We're excited to be back in Columbus for our annual meeting in May 2022. Our annual meeting highlights areas of interest for ID physicians throughout the state of Ohio. It's also an opportunity for physicians and fellows to present in the format of a regional meeting. And we also conduct our business meeting every year at the annual meeting as well. Our next meeting will be at the ID Week in October. Generally, this is in the format of an evening dinner and is in large part a social event. Our next annual meeting will also be in May 2023. It's likely to remain in Columbus, and we're thinking of perhaps encouraging this as more of a social event, perhaps even to include families. We might even work around the Columbus crew and identify a soccer game where we could have our meeting in the morning and early afternoon, and then perhaps build our community and go to a soccer game in the late afternoon. As part of our Qualtrics survey, we did ask the question of what was the preferred option for an IDSO meeting. This idea of having our meeting at the Easton Town Center in Columbus seemed to be the most popular. We also considered whether the Salt Fork Lodge and Conference Center in Cambridge or the Great Wolf Lodge or Kalahari in Sandusky, Ohio would be considerations. And the Easton Town Center did seem to be the most popular option here in Columbus. We also asked whether Fridays or Saturdays were preferred, and it did seem that the consensus is around Saturday as being the best option for the IDSO meeting. As part of our efforts this year, we've been working to develop representative counselors as an advisory board. The IDSO bylaws provide for representative counselors to extend the work of the president, vice president, and secretary treasurer. The concept is that representative counselors should reflect the geographic, clinical, and academic interests of the society. And really what we're trying to achieve is having a direct connection point from the executive committee to each of the major ID practices throughout the state of Ohio. We've identified representative counselors from these practices, and we certainly encourage others to step forward so that we can have as many practices that are represented throughout the state of Ohio. Our other activities have included the development of a membership list of the physicians in the state of Ohio. We're working to promote membership, which is only $50. We have developed an email list of ID physicians in the state of Ohio. By my count, there are 274 active adult ID physicians in the state of Ohio, although I should qualify that this was mostly done via Google searches. We are working to fine-tune our list of pediatric ID physicians, And in future years, we're hopeful to expand our activities to include more fellows, residents, and even medical students, ID pharmacists, microbiologists, and advanced practice providers, all of whom constitute really kind of the greater ID community in our respective practices. We've also worked to develop an IDSO permanent address. That is at 1747 Olentangy River Road, number 1139 in Columbus, Ohio, 43212. Our bylaws provide for committees, and these committees have historically not been active. We provide for an executive committee, but then also a nominating committee, membership committee, constitution and bylaws committee, and program committee. Most of these functions have been served in previous years de facto by the executive committee. And we've really been sort of imagining whether this is the appropriate role for the state organization, whether these committees really are the best use of the time of our members. So we surveyed this, and the bottom two sets of bars are the somewhat likely and extremely likely bars. I think it confirmed our thoughts, which was just that this committee structure is probably not the most useful for our members. And so part of what we've been doing for the coming year is reimagining what our committee structure might look like. With that, I'll present a vision for the 2022-2023 academic year. We have discussed at great length that infectious diseases physicians are among the busiest professionals in the state of Ohio, and we want to ensure that a statewide organization adds value to our physicians and to our practices. With that guideline in mind, we've been discussing potential new committees. We've talked about the development of a statewide monthly case conference. We do want to conduct a second survey that we call Mapping Ohio, which I'll discuss in a little bit. We want to develop quarterly newsletters, and we also plan to incorporate ID Ohio as a 501c3 organization in the coming year. Our executive committee has spent some time brainstorming about which committees would be most useful for the coming year. We've talked about a public policy committee, perhaps a committee revolving around clinical practice issues, maybe the expansion of telemedicine in the state, education committees, mentorship, public health, as perhaps being more useful for our members. And if there is a group of physicians throughout the state of Ohio that would find committee work useful in this regard, that's the type of activity that we would like to promote. So this was also part of our Qualtrics survey earlier this year. And again, the bottom two sets of bars are the somewhat likely and extremely likely bars. We asked whether people would be interested in participating in a statewide committee on these issues. And as you can see, there was considerably more interest in developing a committee structure around the issues of public policy, clinical practice, telemedicine, education, mentorship, and public health. So what might this look like? And in an effort to start this process, we thought that perhaps initiating 3 committees for this coming year might be useful and of interest to our members. Although public policy and public health are not the same thing, for the purposes of an initial attempt to build our committee structure, we thought that grouping public policy and public health together might be a useful approach. Similarly, clinical practice issues might include the expansion of telemedicine throughout the state of Ohio. And we also thought that education and mentorship might be grouped together as an activity that would be useful as well. I made some comments on this PowerPoint slide as to somewhat of what the mandate might look like for each of these committees, but simply to say that we are of the mindset that this constitutes effective action for a statewide organization going forward this coming year. We also plan to perform a second Qualtrics survey in the coming year, and I'm working with a student at the University of Toledo who is hoping to organize this effort. This would actually be 2 surveys in which we survey each ID practice throughout the state of Ohio, and we also survey each hospital in the state of Ohio. The concept would be to identify the reach of infectious diseases practitioners in Ohio through a survey of ID practices, and to also identify opportunities for practice expansion at hospitals that are interested in adding ID services. This would lay the groundwork for a future statewide telemedicine expansion initiative, potentially. And we do want to recruit others that have interest in survey design to this effort as well. We also have speculated that perhaps a once monthly statewide ID grand rounds or a once monthly statewide ID clinical case conference might be of interest. This was also included in our initial Qualtrics survey, and there was quite a bit of interest in the somewhat likely and extremely likely bars here, suggesting to us that this might be a worthwhile activity. The concept here is that this would be a byproduct of the Zoom meeting era. Larger cities such as Boston and Philadelphia will often have citywide case conference, and this would be kind of an offshoot of that concept. It would be similar in format to our annual ID meeting, but the challenge with our annual ID meeting is that not every fellow in the state has a chance to present. A monthly statewide Zoom case conference would be an attempt to identify the most interesting cases in the state of Ohio. It would become an activity of the forthcoming education committee that might even be able to be demonstrated as a scholarly activity in the format of a manuscript. We would have to reach out to program fellowship directors, identify a mutually agreeable time, and find an online format such as Zoom or Microsoft Teams that works for everyone. But we think that this should be a priority for us in the coming year. Our annual meeting will also include comments on bylaw amendments as well as finances. But for our purposes, I will leave these comments at this time, and I'm grateful for your interest in ID Ohio.